Welcome to Hobby Palooza 2025. Hello everyone, I'm Orlando from A Collector's Dream, and I'm honored this year to be your Hobby Palooza ambassador. This year, we're once again proud to support Signatures for Soldiers, a non-profit helping disabled veterans through the power of sports autographs. As you know, we're accepting donations all weekend long, and for every $10 that you donate, you'll earn one raffle entry for some amazing prizes. The preferred way to donate is through Zelle in your banking app to the email jekofma@yahoo.com, JECOFFMA@yahoo.com. If Zelle is not an option, use PayPal Goods and Services to the same email. Let's go ahead and beat last year's total of over $5,800. This hour of Hobby Palooza is brought to you by the Penny Sleever, who are generously donating 10% of this week's sales at thepennysleever.com to Signatures for Soldiers. The Penny Sleever, as you know, has top quality supplies at fair prices. Enjoy the show and have some fun.
What's going on, everybody? Excited to be here for today's session. Chris and I are going to be talking about bridging the gap between vintage and ultra modern collectors. I want to just say thank you to 4 Collectors for giving us this opportunity, and certainly Signatures for Soldiers. If you haven't already, make sure you get in your donations. I do a lot of content. I record, talk to a lot of different collectors. Typically, Sunday is a day that I'm not doing too much, but I'm actually feeling a lot of energy and fired up. And maybe this is like a good way to grease the skids before the National, which is obviously coming up. And we're going to all be meeting each other and talking cards and sharing stories. But I think this topic is going to be fun. It's something that's been in my head for quite some time and haven't really gotten an opportunity to talk about. Maybe we'll do a quick intro for anyone out there who doesn't know Chris or myself, and then we'll just jump in. Chris, I'll pass it to you to kick it off. Maybe just doing an intro of who you are and what do you do.
Thank you, Brett. Good morning, all. This is one of the earliest pieces of content I've ever been a part of, like in terms of time-wise. So I've got a different energy coming today. And I'll just introduce myself as a collector of Michael Jordan, Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, Patrick Mahomes, Christian McCaffrey, Le'Veon Bell, and Brock Purdy. I think I covered everything. So those are my main PCs. I'm a player collector. Brett, you had a recent episode where one of your co-hosts, Pac Nicholson, introduced the question, in the Venn diagram of the player collector, the set collector, and the team collector, who deserves the card the most if all 3 are competing for a card? And that just occurred to me as I introduced myself as the player collector. And you had a nice rant on player collectors too that I liked. But anyway, and then the other part that I'll say about myself is I am one of the co-founders of Card Ladder, along with Christina, Josh, Cardboard Chronicles, and Nick, aka Stiff Arm Wax. And my titular role there is head of research and CEO. So, all right, that's enough introducing. How are you, Brett? What's your introduction sound like?
You wear many hats. I'll classify myself as a collector of collections. For anyone watching, you'll see a wall of vinyl in the back. I'm a big music guy. That doesn't stop here. It goes through the basement, throughout the house. My wife is a saint, but obviously too a big collector. My collections are really focused around my hometown and my hometown team. I am from Indianapolis, born and raised, big Pacers, Colts, Fever fan, and really my collecting revolves around those teams. Collecting projects, and, collecting athletes from those teams that I have a strong connection with. So that's the collecting portion. I run Stacking Slabs and Stacking Slabs Network. It kind of started as a passion it started as a passion project that evolved to me putting in my 2 weeks notice to my CEO last November to go all in on building Stacking Slabs and content. So it's been an incredible ride. We put out 6 episodes right now every week on the Stacking Slabs main feed, have an incredible group of partners getting an opportunity to dig into very focused topics around cards and, building a stage for collectors to share stories. So really enjoy the hobby. I spend way too much time thinking about topics like today's topic and digging into it, but let's get on into it. And I'll maybe just start with this topic occurred to me through the lens of the content that I've been producing for a long time. And I mostly collect modern, mostly collect ultra modern, and I haven't been as tuned into the vintage side of the house. And I know vintage is certainly important and just seems like kind of high school in a way, with just the way the internet works, where you've got these different groups of collectors that are all in different parts and everyone kind of stays isolated and there's very little interaction. And thought, one of these goals this year is to let's bring on more vintage collectors. Let's learn. And I'll give a shout out to a couple Tonys. Tony TJ is online, and Tony Southern Collector 14. Recently having a lot of discussions with them and conversations and showcasing them and hearing the stories, hearing how they think about collecting. And I get done with these episodes and I'd be like, yeah, what they're collecting is inherently different than what I collect, but the mindset and mentality with how they approach what they do is very similar. And I thought when I was, presented with this opportunity, I was like, this will be a fun topic to get into. So as I was thinking about this description, there was like 3 big takeaways that I want to share with you all. And hopefully Chris and I can do a good enough job of like exploring these avenues as we dive in. But what vintage and ultra modern collectors can learn from each other, I think that's one thing. Another topic is why the line between the eras might be more blurred than we think. And then ultimately how to build mutual respect and maybe even shared collectors. I'm a very curious person. I know Chris, and the lots of conversations we've had, is a very curious person. So I think maybe it's time to dig in. Chris, before we just like dive right in, do you have any opening thoughts or remarks regarding this conversation you wanna address?
I thought that was a great breakdown of what's coming, and I've seen the show notes. I'm very excited for them. Something reminded me, I don't know, just maybe being awake and functioning at a weird hour has my brain thinking in different ways. I was reminded of the first time I ever appeared on the Stacking Slabs network, which was 5 years ago in 2020. So this is a half decade of content creation and collaborations, which is I just suddenly got nostalgic about that, which is kind of cool. But something else I want to throw out, just in case I reference these terms throughout the course of the discussion. So for Card Ladder, we wanted to create era indexes, and that forced us to pick actually firm boundaries, even though I agree with you that the boundaries are definitely fuzzy between eras. So if I do mention these terms, if I say pre-war, I'm referring to before 1946. If I say vintage, I'm referring to 1946 through 1983. And I think it's obvious kind of why those are the distinctions, just based on pre-war and post-war. We're referencing World War II. Then modern goes from 1984 to 2008. And the reason for that is because the cutoff there is the Michael Jordan rookie year and in the Star productions from 1984 to 45. So modern goes from 84 through 2008. And then finally, ultra modern, 2009 through 2025, and that's because Panini took over licenses in 2009. And so here's the thing: from 2026 and onward, I think we need a new title as Fanatics unifies the 3 licenses. And that's some food for thought. Is what's the next era called? What comes after? So pre-war, vintage, modern, and ultra modern. What comes next? What should we call that? Postmodern?
Yeah, you've got my wheels spinning already, which it's maybe not as a good thing as we enter this, but we're just going to dive in. What I think, I just want to make it very clear. I know there's a lot of vintage collectors watching this, and hopefully a lot of modern and ultra modern collectors as well. But I think by setting the stage, it'd be safe to say that Chris and I both focus in more on the modern and ultra modern bucket. I talked about my hometown and my team collecting, and it really revolves in those 2 zones. Chris, I know you started with Jordan, you started with Michael Jordan collecting in your re-entry back into the hobby, but maybe like as you've evolved, you mentioned all those players. Is there any specific kind of moment that helped shape the philosophy for you around how you think about collecting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I collect basically 3 cards from 3 decades: the '90s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. I definitely otherwise I don't think I own a card from any other decade than those three. So even within the niche of Michael Jordan collecting, I'm really focused on the '90s, and that being because I was a child of the '90s. I grew up in the '90s, very nostalgic for it, big Michael Jordan fan, etc. So when I came back to the hobby about 9 years ago, I focused on Michael Jordan, and everything that I say and that follows in this episode, I'm going to try to critique constructively the eras and the stuff that I collect, and then try to use that critique to maybe build a bridge, as you've sketched, sort of as one of the purposes of this piece of content, to build a bridge to the other eras, and particularly the vintage and the pre-war eras. So that's the point of view I'm going to try to come from, is how can I critique myself as a collector to hopefully maybe better build that bridge. So, but yeah, Michael Jordan collecting was the start. Michael Jordan collecting itself is sort of a bridge if you really think about how his career spanned the 80s and the style of production, and sort of basketball even experiencing a hiatus of license holding by a major manufacturer during a portion of that decade, to to a single product a year, to a few products a year, to the proliferation of products in the 90s, and then even the wind down a bit in the early 2000s as he was a Wizards player. So I've definitely learned a lot from my Jordan collecting days, Brett.
So I spend way too much time digging into research, looking at the different eras, looking at the cards within the eras, meeting the collectors who collect the cards in different eras, and understanding kind of mindset, mentality, how they approach their own personal collecting. And I know you, on the flip side, you obviously do a lot of content as well, but you also support Card Ladder, which is, a platform that collectors in all different eras are using, digging into data, taking in customer support requests, learning more about, the users of your platform. I'd be curious, maybe as we dive into this, what do you see as maybe the biggest cultural and mindset differences between the vintage collector and kind of the modern or ultra modern collectors that we see today?
I think we, as collectors of modern and ultra modern, and this is going to particularly apply to like ultra modern, is that I think one of the things that we can learn from and understand more about the vintage and the pre-war collecting is that not everything needs to be a PSA 10, and that condition actually is one of the gateways into really beginning to enjoy and enjoy collecting from those eras, and exercising collecting agency, or taking control, taking the reins of my collecting experience, because the variety of conditions and the different ways that cards can be impacted in terms of their condition. Are you high on registration? Is the registration of the color and the images on the surface, is that an important criteria for you? Because if so, you're going to target a slightly different set of cards than if centering is one of your main criteria, and if eye appeal, if that portion of eye appeal is really important to you. And I know I don't hear it discussed as much, but in my earlier days, I would hear a lot more discussion about sort of, are you an edges and corners guy, or are you a centering guy? And then there's a lot of nuance within how the different facets of eye appeal and technical grade can impact how collectors from that era collect. And us in ultramodern, by comparison, we're hyper focused on, is it a 10 or not? And maybe we'll take a 9, maybe. And so there's just a difference there. And I understand why it exists. I mean, there's so many ultramodern cars, and there's so many ultramodern parallels that's sort of, that we don't need to be as precise and narrowing in trying to examine the condition of cards, but we could learn a lot, I think, from how those collectors make it a passion of theirs to study condition and to study the byproducts of the production process. Like last night, I was listening to Josh Adams sort of talk about how the Brett Hull rookie card, it's almost impossible to find that well centered, but then he went into the reason why, which is because that card was located on the bottom right corner of that particular sheet, as it was printed. And so, you know, these are the nuances and the approaches that those different eras take that maybe that we don't fully understand, I think, in our era.
We've talked about this in one-to-one private conversations and a lot of different things over the course of you and I doing content together for the last 5 years. And you brought up something that just like stuck in my mind. And it's this concept of like, if someone heard about sports cards in the hobby and it triggered in their brain and it was something that they did as a kid and they wanted to go explore sports cards in 2025 and they don't know anything about it from the last time they collected as a kid, what are they going to do? Right? They're going to go to Google, they're going to go to YouTube, they'll probably get on some social channel and they'll start consuming content, right, to try to get educated on like what's happening in the space. And I think so much of what we see and what comes at us on a regular basis is regarding like the grade and the value and the chase for PSA 10s. And while we're both collectors and it's both safe to say, like, the more PSA 10s in our collection, the better. But it's also not about that, especially it's not all about that if we're trying to just buy cards that we have a connection with that we want to keep in our collection for the long run. So I say all that where like right now in this era of the hobby, like the PSA 10 is up front and center, and most collectors coming in it, they might think like this is what we have to go chase no matter what the card is or without any context. How do we then get to this stage of, if that's what's being promoted on the front end of the hobby, and then on the back end of the hobby, you have all these collectors collecting vintage for so long where it's next to impossible to not only afford, but to even find a PSA 10 copy of the respective vintage card. How do we, I guess, just as new participants in the hobby, how do we find who's right, who's not? Is it just like self-discovery, researching and figuring it out on yourself or by yourself? Or do you think there's a better way for that new collector to better understand the differences between kind of ultra modern and vintage and why each operates a little bit different out front?
Yeah, great question. And I love that we're on the platform, or we're on to discuss it, because something that I've learned over the last 6 months in particular, largely thanks to Jeremy Lee extending me an invite to appear on Sports Cards Live, is that there is an incredible community of vintage and pre-war collectors on YouTube specifically. And once I plugged into that community and started subscribing to some of the collectors who are on here, you know, whether it's Dan, who's producing the show, Mike Petty, who's hilarious, who's in the chat, who's, you know, one of the cherished personalities. You mentioned Tony. You know, I mean, there's Junk Wax Hero. I mean, he's got a very popular channel. There's so many. That's just scratching the surface. Clemente Collector. There's so many guys who I've started watching. You know, midlife. There's just so many guys, and I've started watching these channels and consuming their content. And not only is it all educational, it's all community driven. It's just Mangini. I mean, so many of these guys, like, they all contribute to each other's content. They collaborate. They share ideas. They bounce ideas off each other. They can agree. They can disagree. They can debate. The YouTube world in particular. And then once I plugged into that community, my algorithm started feeding me more and more of it. So I'm still in this discovery process of finding more and more channels. And there are a ton of them. There's a ton of channels. There's a ton of collectors who focus and specialize in this area. And of course, the For Collectors channel is certainly a part of that network too. So I've found these collectors, I've found these content creators, and if I'm at the card ladder booth at the National and somebody comes up to me and says, how do I learn about vintage and pre-war collecting? I would send them directly to some of these YouTube accounts, and I would say, just plug into this network, because you're going to meet great people and you're going to get access to a ton of resources.
I love that. And I think it takes conversation. I see Tony in the chat, meeting Tony, understanding his passion for baseball eras, collecting. It's been transformational for me to better understand that community of collectors as a modern and ultra modern collector. But then naturally, like, there's tension between these groups, and you see the tension, and it's whether it's conversations online, why are you collecting that way? oh, this new stuff is just junk, back and forth. Like, why do you think there's sometimes tension or a misunderstanding between those two groups?
I'm really interested to hear what you have to say to this too, because I saw this topic on the show notes, and there definitely are tensions. A lot of it, I think, just comes from just having totally different points of view on things. And one of those sources of disagreement is that as ultra modern collectors in particular, modern collectors understand variance in condition a bit more. Like if one is a 90s PMG collector, we're happy to have a 4 in our collection. We're happy to take the card in any condition, and a lot of vintage and pre-war collectors feel that way too. And there's also been the development of this idea of own appeal as an entry into the topic of discussion that complements or sits next to the idea of eye appeal. And the idea of own appeal is that I want to own a card because owning that card with nothing else attached, regardless of condition, regardless of eye appeal, I just want to own that card. The appeal of owning it is so strong, and that's something that I see echoed in the vintage and the pre-war communities that I also see sort of echoed in modern and ultra modern too. But for us, we really start to feel that way when it comes to the gold prisms and stuff like that, right? Like then when we have to get to that sort of type of card, and then own appeal really, really kicks in. So but that's an overlap, but we're talking more about source of disagreement. So like one was condition, right? Like the understanding that the ultra modern collector has for what condition cards should come in is I think a source of disagreement, just because I think ultra modern, we don't have a lot of experience with understanding the variety of condition and the production techniques and manufacturing techniques that happened from that era. Another source of disagreement is sort of what are the factors of the experience that generate a lot of excitement and joy for the collecting journey. So like Tony, Southern Collector, put out a video maybe a week and a half ago that's an hour-long deep dive into the career of Ted Williams. And I loved that piece of content. I listened to it. I learned from it. It was biographical of Ted Williams. It really went beyond, a statistical background or a list of accolades or a resume. It really just, it was an hour of telling a story about him and then showing some of his cards. And an ultra modern collector, I think we could learn from that. I think something that we would struggle with, that we could really learn from is how do we get into long form storytelling about players and their narrative arcs and their careers in the way that vintage and pre-war collectors are interested. How do we bridge the historian impulse? Because I think we have an ultra modern too. I think we want to feel as connected to our favorite players, teams, and sets as vintage and pre-war collectors do, but we don't really know how to do it quite as well. Partially because these guys are still writing their stories, partially because the media landscape of this era is just very much soundbite driven and hot take driven. And so I think that's a source of tension too, is sort of, we want to be able to have that sort of unbridled passion for the subjects and the areas that we collect. So there's a couple ideas, Brett. What do you think about that? Or is there anything you can add to that?
Yeah, so I saw a comment that fly by from a vintage collector about how the way the hobby is presented, especially by loud voices, can be misleading, which I think is a very accurate and astute point. Like as a modern and ultra modern collector, I feel the same way often, and I feel the same way and oftentimes. But the main thing that for me that I find and I'm able to connect with other collectors, whether it's vintage, Pokemon, it doesn't matter, is when I can have a conversation with someone and I can learn something from that group, and I can tell by the end of the group that individual has a deep and strong enough connection with that category that they collect in, that they would rather have the cards in their collection than the cash in their bank accounts. And I sell cards. We all sell cards to keep the engine running. But I think oftentimes a lot of vintage collectors see what's happening on the front end of the hobby, and it's all about transactional mindset. Let's get this in our hands and see if we can sell it for a percentage and go over and over and over and over again. And it's like you see all this activity when you've got vintage collectors that are out getting on planes, chasing cards, trying to get cards they've been chasing for 20, 30 years because they want that card in their collection. And then that's their mindset. And then they see, flip open whatever YouTube channel, and it's just like deal after deal and money turning over. And it's like, do we even care about the cards? So I think that's probably one of the things that I've observed. And I'll say this, Chris, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think what's getting lost in this latest era of collecting is just the idea around research and having outside of podcasts and YouTube shows that are scattered everywhere, having a central point where any collector can go to understand the history behind sets, understand breakdowns of products, when a certain product ended, when another one began. And I don't know, like when the more I've explored vintage and pre-war, it seems like that group is very organized around making sure the history of what they collect is preserved. And if you want to learn about something, there's going to be someone there to educate. And education, I've preached this till I'm blue in the face. I think the biggest gap right now in our industry is education. And education, I'm not saying it like a 30-second Instagram reel or TikTok. It's like education and having that be a central focus from the manufacturer side to the loudest voices. And, I think the vintage side has education as kind of one of its core pillars. And I think education is something I'm pushing for with Stacking Slabs every day. And I hope that more outlets are mindful of it. So I just ranted, but you struck a nerve a little bit with tossing it back to me.
No, that's good. That's you have been focused on substance and education from day one, and that's definitely one of the philosophical overlaps between a content creator like yourself, a content creator like I aspire to be, and what the vintage and pre-war communities contribute. And something else that I've thought about. So I recently saw some videos from the Instagram page for the Dallas Card Show, which featured like ultra modern collectors, and they were sort of going through the topic of like who's overrated and underrated in the hobby. And obviously this is a fun question. This isn't an overly serious question. But and this was actually from like the Dallas Card Show branch of Cincinnati. So like the Dallas Card Show of Cincinnati. This is how deep in the weeds I am right now. And so they asked like a handful of people, overrated, underrated, and it was mostly just discussing, active baseball and football players. And, somebody chimed in and said, like, I think JJ McCarthy might be a little bit underrated. Somebody chimed in and said, Mahomes is a little bit overrated right now. What has he done lately and stuff like that. And I just, and then I got to think, well, Mahomes, he's a pretty decorated player, But then I got to think to myself, like, I love the total MVPs approach for a really zoomed out, very basic level ranking of players. Mahomes has 5 total MVPs, and I'm very excited about that. I collect Mahomes. I think that's amazing. Well,
hey, Chris, explain what you mean by total MVPs.
Total MVPs.
Understand the concept.
Sorry. Total MVPs is just the most simple metric possible. How many regular season MVPs and how many Super Bowl MVPs? Just add them together and you get a number. And so you start thinking to yourself, like, I'm very excited about Mahomes having 5. Well, Joe Montana has 5 too. And Aaron Rodgers has 5 too. And then Peyton Manning has 6. And then Tom Brady has 8. And then there are players from earlier eras who stack up along this list too. And like, we're talking about like Patrick Mahomes versus JJ McCarthy and stuff. Or like, if I go to basketball, the list of total MVPs of basketball, like MJ at 11, then you have Kareem and LeBron at 8, and then you have Magic at 6. And like, when you start looking at these top 10 lists, and in baseball, the list is the largest and the most robust because that sport has the deepest history as the MLB as a professional league. And so you start looking at this list, and it's like, we're talking about like JJ McCarthy being underrated and stuff like that. And I'm like, and then you look at the guys who are collecting the vintage and the pre-war space, and these guys are collecting players who are top 50, top 100 all time, Hall of Famers, top 10 all time. Like the place that I'm hoping that all of us are hoping that our players can maybe get close to, that maybe can join the company of these guys. Like I'm hoping that one of my PC players, Nikola Jokic, can maybe become a top 5 player one day if the next 5 years go as well as the last 5 years went, which is a huge if. And then I'm sure a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar collector is sitting there looking at me like, why don't you could just collect Kareem?
Yeah.
He's got 8 total MVPs. He's got 6 regular season MVPs. He's got 2 finals MVPs. I also like to look at stats. I mean, Kareem has an argument to be the greatest statistical player of all time. Like, or a guy like collecting Wilt Chamberlain. Like, you guys are excited about players averaging 30, 35 points a game. Wilt averaged 50 points a game. So I think that's a sort of a source of tension disagreement too, is like, we're all hoping that our guys maybe get into these lists one day, and the vintage of the pre-war collectors, and they don't only collect Hall of Fame and stuff. Like, they collect team, they get into nuances, they get into obscurity. I don't want to reduce them to that, but I think there's like the Wilt Chamberlain collectors sitting here like, guys, like, yeah, great, Luka had a 73-point game, Wilt had a 100-point game. So
I love this, and maybe this can help bridge us into like the overlap between the two groups and what might be the same. And this is what I can tell, and I want to just maybe understand like collecting traits or habits that you think might be universal. As you were talking through that example, it resonated with me, and I think about, well, why don't I go collect Johnny Unitas if I collect Peyton Manning? And there's many internal reasons, for me for that. But then also it comes down to like the cards themselves. Like this is sports cards, but a lot of times what gets lost in translation is the actual card and like what appeals to us as a collector, whether it's rarity, scarcity, serial numbering, just the technology behind cards. All these factors are all in this big pot, and it's like we make these decisions where we line up like player, era, type of card, rarity and scarcity. And we've got these checklists, and then we like identify based on that checklist for these different groups. And I think that's across the board, like everybody does that. But I want to maybe understand from your perspective when it comes to like your observations regarding each group, like what have you maybe in its simplest form realized where there's like key overlap between those groups and where there might be opportunity, regardless of what the player or the set they're collecting, to have a conversation to find some common ground?
There definitely is overlap. So I've seen it mentioned several times in the comments that, or at least from several content creators in there, that sort of, well, I collect both actually. I have, or all. I have vintage, I have pre-war, and I have modern and ultra modern. There are plenty of people who collect all, and there's plenty of people who, even if they don't collect all, they have a real appreciation for collectors of every stripe. So like 2 guys that I didn't mention earlier, but that were some of the earliest collectors from vintage and pre-war that I started following as sort of social media content creators. Now they have a cool podcast too, is Nate in Cardboard Veritas and Matthew 1956 Tops Guy. And those guys would listen even to the crossover and some of the more ridiculous things that Josh and I would say, and with just a great level of tolerance and just there's definitely more understanding, I think, in general, flowing from the vintage and the pre-war towards the modern and the ultra modern than is the other way. And sort of that's not surprising, right? Like the vintage and the pre-war collectors typically going to be a person of more experience, a person that's just lived a more have more life under their belts, and that type of person tends to be able to see things from multiple points of view better than the upstart who's in the modern and the ultra modern space. That doesn't always hold, but I do think that holds. But in terms of the overlaps, one overlap that just stands out to me so much, and I think you and I both like really have in common, one of the things that really resonates with us is like that flash of inspiration. Like you have a very cool content series dedicated to smashing bin, and one of the ideas that points to is capturing the moment of seeing a card that just strikes you, that just resonates with you, and you don't hesitate, and you just you jump in and you go for that card immediately. And I think that's something that the vintage and the pre-war collectors have too. But what activates it for us, I think, is sort of is oftentimes rarity, or like or a card from a really special brand or type that activates us. And the analog in pre-war and vintage, I think, is a card that has the particular type of eye appeal or the particular aesthetic that just sort of gives them the nostalgia for that player or that card, or sort of something that just that actually the way that particular card presents, the way that it's particularly centered, or the way that the sort of the edges have been worn, or just sort of the rounding of the corners, that the nuance that they zoom in on, the thing that drives some of them to smash bin is the particular emotion that particular copy gives them. So one of the cool things about pre-worn vintage is that everybody's collecting the same card, just a different print of it, just a different copy of it. But one guy's copy might have better corners and edges, another guy's copy might have better centering. And then there's this art of expression that really lies in discovering the particular copy that speaks to that particular collector. And we have that too, but we do it through this particular gold out of 10. The gold out of 10 is our version of the card with the perfect centering that speaks to us. What do you think about that?
I love this. No matter what, like rarity and scarcity, the more the hobby sinks its teeth in you, the more you are going to seek and desire those things, regardless of the category that you collect in. So that is certainly true for me as a collector, Chris. I know based on the one of one path that you are just on right now, that I'm sure the same is for you as well. You said something there about nostalgia, and I want to hit this really quick, where I can go have a conversation with any vintage collector, and you name Matthew and Nate, who are both great collectors and great. I'm glad they got mentioned. I've had conversation with them, very insightful. But you talk with anybody in vintage, and nostalgia is such a key piece, right? The history, the nostalgia. When I was with my grandpa, this is what, and those stories and that introduction. And I think like maybe on the modern or ultra modern side that doesn't get brought up this too much is like nostalgia plays a big role. And it might seem crazy, but I think back to my return to collecting, and take a product, for instance, 2019 Prism. I see 2019 Prism now, and yeah, what pulled a lot of people in was the Zion and Ja craze at that time. They were the rookies in 2019 Prism, and 2019 Prism became like this tent pole for all these new collectors that come in. So although this product was released 6 years ago, I'll see those cards in that set in any parallel, and it'll bring me back, and it'll make my return to the hobby very nostalgic. And I appreciate that. I appreciate it's the way life moves so quickly. And I as a fan of sports, and as a fan of the Indianapolis Colts, and I think about a player like Edgerrin James, for instance, who put in great work and is a Hall of Famer. And I think about my collection, and all of a sudden, all it took for me this year was I watched a highlight package of Edge and remembered how much he meant to me. And I've been on this path of finding key Edge cards to add to my collection. And these cards, obviously, Edge was a rookie in 99. A lot of these cards are 2000 on the last 25 years. But like in that era of collecting, there's so much nostalgia for me. As a 40-year-old guy now, kind of digging back, I'd love maybe do you think like nostalgia and the way nostalgia is approached from each of these groups is different, or is it same? Like, what are some of your observations you've made on the nostalgia front between different segments?
That's exactly what I was thinking about as you were talking about Edge, and like you have a particular connection to him. You did watch him play, then you can watch a highlight reel, and all of a sudden that sends you down memory lane. And I think about this. I have a slightly different perspective on the level of importance that nostalgia has in my collecting path. It is very high. Sometimes I think I downplay it. But if you look at who I collect, it's all players that I've like rooted for passionately at some point in my life. But I do think there's a path to nostalgia that can be activated without ever having watched that particular player play. And it's nostalgia for something bigger. It's nostalgia for a sport. It's nostalgia for history. It's nostalgia for Americana. It's nostalgia for culture. It's a general nostalgia that can be activated conceptually through connecting to things that I might not have ever had a firsthand interaction with, but that I can appreciate what it means in the broader constellation of important historical people, events, moments, and so forth within a sport. So like I can have a sense of nostalgia for the origins of basketball, because I can imagine how it unfolded. I can imagine how that story took place over time. I can imagine how the sport developed and evolved. The introduction of the shot clock, the introduction of the 3-point line, the so many different pieces of the history of the sport that somehow I can connect to them without ever having directly experienced them, because they're part of a bigger story. And I just come in a little bit later in that chain, but we don't need to look very far to see that this world is full of admirers of history, of people who are passionate to connect to history, to the various parts of history, whether it's, the history of geopolitical conflict, or whether it's the history of civilizations, or the collecting of historical artifacts and documents. I think there's definitely something to learn there about how nostalgia can sort of happen vicariously, that it doesn't need to happen on a first-person basis. It can happen on a broader conceptual level too.
I love this. I want to maybe dig into kind of mutual respect and between each groups. And I learned so much from. I probably learned. I learn more from other categories, collectors in other categories that I don't collect in, than my own. And it's mindset, philosophy, mentality, how information is shared, all of these things. I try to pick these pieces, and like it goes into like my own way and my own approach to collecting. And I want to maybe explore just like what vintage collectors can learn from ultra modern and vice versa. And I'll just like, so I'm thinking through this. I think like this idea of history, we've talked about it a lot. It is a topic that's always on my mind, but I think as ultra modern collectors, like observing the way vintage collectors approach collecting, it's from a historical lens. It's almost pushed to be from a historical lens, but the passion amplifies it through stories, and those stories are what makes people feel connection. It elicits emotion, and I see what's happening in these conversations in the pre-war vintage side, and it excites me. It excites me because I'm like, I hope at some point the stuff that I collect now, those same types of conversations are happening 20 years ago. So I think as a ultra modern collector, I think there's a lot we can learn from the way history is used on the vintage side. And then vice versa, I think a lot about movement. And I know I maybe used it as in a negative way up front, but I think movement of cards in and out of collections, that's a pillar of ultra modern, and this idea of consolidating and grabbing a card, getting rid of 20 cards for one card. And I know it's not exclusive to vintage or to ultra modern, but I feel like is more prevalent. And so I think maybe vintage collectors, when they see that massive card on one of the big auction houses that might seem way too much out of their price range, to take those cards that they've had in their collection for 20 years, what I like to call Judgment Day, and say, okay, this card that you see that is beautiful, gorgeous, you can't stop thinking about, that's going to cost that's going to be the cost of a car, or maybe even a down payment on a new home. Like, you've built the equity through all of the years of collecting in your collection. Like, evaluate that card that's up right now and the cards that you currently have in your collection. And maybe it makes sense to make a move and say goodbye. And you talk about the utility value that we've gotten from these cards that have been in our collection for 5, 10, 15 years. Sometimes it's these moments where we say to ourselves, man, it was fun to share this card. It was fun to talk about this card. It was fun owning this card. It was fun to share chats with other collectors who have this card. But you know what? It's time to move on and say goodbye, and change is tough for any of us. But I feel like ultra modern collectors, based on the nature of how the hobby's marketed, have mastered the saying goodbye. And so I think maybe vintage collectors, if you're looking for something to like maybe learn, and there's ways to do it, and there's a lot of good collectors who focus in on consolidation and talk about it. But those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what each group you think can learn from each other.
Yeah, I love that you've found a way to introduce the topic of Judgment Day, because and the idea that and I had never heard you lay it out quite as explicitly as when you made the case for the collector who needs to sell things from time to time. And you made that case in the most recent football card podcast with John. with Pac Nicholson. And I thought it was maybe like the culmination of sort of years of you thinking about the idea, and then just sort of, you know, a raw, uncut delivery of the idea that unless the resources are unlimited, that the most pure collector will find times when they have to make a trade-off of either I can keep the things I've accumulated so far, or a few things have to won't survive Judgment Day. A few things have to get let go so I can add something else to it. And like on that note, like, because if we accept the premise that almost every collector, except those with the most vast resources, their collection's going to have to experience Judgment Day every once in a while. The thing that I think about with that is I think about how the ultramodern collector is hoping and praying and is also concerned that ultramodern cards will fare as well 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. I mean, there are cards. I recently pushed a headline to the Card Letter newsfeed of a Cap Anson card. I think it was Cap Anson from 1887. Okay, that card is 150 years later. That card is setting all-time highs. You know, I think I even made a headline about something like 150-year all-time high or something, right? Like, okay, so like the ultramodern collector is hoping that our era of stuff can do as well as from a market point of view, so that when we have to take our collections to Judgment Day from time to time, that we don't get killed, that we don't, you know, lose our shirts because we collect ultramodern. But the real tension there is that a lot of us are going to lose our shirts because we're either prospecting on something, or the market is inflated and there's a lot of hype built around new product releases, and there's speculating and there's flipping and stuff. And so, you know, the Judgment Day thing is such an interesting topic. There's such an interesting overlap there. There's and you can understand why the ultramodern collector feels more of a tendency to want to move on a little more quickly, just because we're not so sure if our markets are going to endure the way that markets from earlier eras have.
Oh, yes. I hope everybody who's watching this understands that. And we are very transparent about this. I think maybe, Chris, you and I to a fault is sometimes like our passion takes over and our excitement takes over. And maybe like when the dust settles, like a month after a purchase, like we ask ourselves, yeah, we probably overpaid for that, but we love this card and it's a connection. And there's all these circumstances happening outside of us that we can't control, and it might go down. But I think part of it is that there's a lot of collectors in modern and ultra modern who don't care. And it's publicized about making money off of everything, but you know, we don't like to lose money on the cards, but ultimately, like, we make the decision, like, this is that moment. We need this card because of whatever reason. And you got to be okay with, and maybe in the short term, losing a little bit of money. But I don't know. I think that's kind of what I've learned just is a hallmark of a lot of modern and ultra modern collectors that I really look up to. I know we've got maybe 7 minutes here, so I want to. Well, this is for anyone who has not listened to a Brett and Chris conversation. This is very typical, where there's like a million topics and we just focus in. So
I want to talk paragraph 1 of this.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm trying to like pick and choose. But I want to talk about psychology a little bit. And you'd be a great person to like highlight this, because you have you're building and involving this platform that like looks at the market on a regular basis through values of cards. How do you see, and it can be exclusive to each of these groups, or you can put it all together, but like, how has the collector psychology maybe evolved in the hobby since it's become more visible, prices become more transparent, and it's more driven by market activity?
Oh man, you know, that's a difficult question. It just requires knowledge of so many different aspects of where we've come from and where we're going. Let me think about it for a little bit, and if it's okay, let me turn it around to you in case if you have an idea, maybe, or there's a thread here that you particularly want to tug on here.
Yeah, I overanalyze and overthink human psychology and behavior a lot. For anyone who hasn't listened to my content, I spent 15 years before going all in on the hobby and my content working in marketing functions and B2B software companies from all shapes and sizes, big to small. And really my job ultimately, yeah, I did marketing and I worked with the sales team and I created content and built brand. But ultimately, I spent every day of those 15 years intimately trying to understand the mindset and the mentality of the people who we as a business were trying to reach. Because I realized early in my career, if I didn't put myself in the shoes of the end consumer and understand why they woke up at a certain way in the morning and thought about certain things and consumed certain pieces of content, then I would be just doing a really bad job. And so this obsession with uh, influence and persuasion and all of these topics that go into kind of my day-to-day job trickled over into my hobby life. And so I think about it a lot. And if you listen to the Wednesday episode on Stacking Slabs, most of the time they're conversations with myself about human psychology and how it fits into collecting. And so one of the things that stands out to me that is very apparent and evident, and I know this happens in ultra modern. I'm not sure if it happens in vintage. I suspect it does, but it's this comparing ourselves to others, and you see what one collector picks up and you feel the need to go pick something up regardless of the price. It can be you can say, oh, this is what I need to go do, this is what I need to collect now because these collectors in this space are doing it. And I think to me that is one of the things within ultra modern that you see it and you see people doing it and then you see them selling cards. And I think part of it is the transparency around prices. People feel like they can go make and win big. And ultimately what it comes down to for me is always like, what is your North Star with your collecting? And does this decision you're about to make on this card align with that North Star? And if it doesn't, then it's probably not a good decision. So that's something I think about a lot when it comes to just overall psychology. And I think obviously I spend way too much time in Card Ladder and I use it to fuel my content. And but I think without a Card Ladder or pricing and transparency, I'm not sure collectors would fall into that same trap. I go back to the days of when we just had a Beckett magazine, and I felt like during that era maybe collectors thought more on their own or based on their own needs and desires, and now prices are going to move people in one direction or the other. And oftentimes I'm not sure it's the right direction for them. And it might be a little motivated by money. So that's kind of my thoughts around it.
Terrific thoughts. We're coming up against the end, so I just want to add one little note here. I saw great comments from Contrarian Cards, who said the ultra-modern collectors I know are very sharp. They focus on the rare and scarce cards of established players. That's a little peek into the psychology of the type of ultra-modern collector that I aspire to be as well. And Contrarian Cards had an amazing appearance on the Iowa Dave podcast maybe a week or two ago. I consumed it during a walk, and I was so taken with some portions of that conversation. I took out a few clips from the transcript and posted them to my Twitter as he was sort of comparing the Topps era to the Panini era, and he was talking about how he uses WAR. I mean, all the stuff that he was talking about, advanced analytics and his approaches and stuff. I just loved it. So that was a great comment there. And Brett, thank you for doing this, man. This has been a lot of fun. I was very honored to join, and this has been a great discussion.
One more quick one. Shout out Jason. Always enjoy my interactions with him, Contrarian Cards. But maybe as content creators and community organizers, leaders, how maybe do you think we can foster curiosity rather than division in the hobby? And we've got a minute, so just as quick as you possibly can. Just one thought on that.
I don't know, man. However this came to pass, however this happened, this is great, right? This is good, but also like we've tried to be very thoughtful. The reality on the ground is that there's a lot of ultra modern collecting sentiment that's just very narrowly focused. What do I like? I hate everything else, and that can be a tendency of collecting in general. So I don't know, just a mindset shift of and establishing olive branches and collaboration. I think those things can go a long way.
Shout out for collectors. Really appreciate the platform. This was a ton of fun. Been enjoying Hobby Palooza. Everyone go support Signatures for Soldiers. Looking forward to watching the rest of the content.
Love my hobby. Keep collecting baseball cards.
But hey, we want to keep the lights on here at Four Collectors Studios, so hit the like button for us, guys.
So thanks everybody for coming, and yeah, we'll see you next time on Four Collectors.
All right, guys, have a great rest of your night. Subscribe to the Four Collectors channel if you haven't done so yet, and we'll see you soon.
All right, guys. Clemente Collector has said we hit a grand slam, so that makes me feel good.